Okay, I hope you all enjoyed your dinner, and I made the joke before that we're already behind. As it turns out, as much detail as there was in the 90 minutes of the previous lecture, I have 50% more material for this lecture. So we'll see. This is the one I don't know exactly how we're going to get through, but it's Communism 2.0, as I've called it, in the evolution of communism. So I'm using that kind of computer motif. 1.0 was the theoretical, apostle-driven Marx model, and now we're going to move into Soviet Union primarily, industrial communism or state communism. We'll also talk a little bit about China under Mao. So if you find yourself humming the Tetris theme in your head throughout, that's okay. I was doing it while I wrote it. And if you didn't know, that song is actually not Soviet, although it sounds like it could be. It is a Russian folk tune about haggling peddlers, and it's actually got a really cool dance that goes with it. I would tell you what it's called, but I can't pronounce Russian things. I have it, and you can see it when it's in writing in front of you. It's Korobaniki or something like that. I can't say Russian things. We're just going to not do it right. So this lecture and the next, tomorrow morning, are going to talk about the split into Eastern and Western Marxism. Those are going to be kind of, catch-all terms. I'm going to start each of these lectures, these last three lectures, with about 1 million names that like I did with the religions in the previous one. There's about 1 million things we could call this. I'm going to really settle on it on either Eastern Marxism or on industrial communism or on state communism for reasons that I think are going to be pretty apparent. In the morning, we're going to talk about critical theory, basically, which is the kind of main part of Western Marxism in the development of woke. But what's going on, the reason there's this split, which starts literally in roughly 1917, which is when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, is because you had two regions of the world that were now grappling with the fact that Marx was wrong. And they had to solve a Marx was wrong problem, but nobody is allowed to say Marx was wrong. Now, that's not totally true. The Soviets did not say that Marx was wrong, but the Western Marxists did admit that he made some mistakes. The way the communists usually tally this is they use an analogy to your fingers, and it depends on how they want to break it down. They'll say that the previous guy, maybe it was, Marx in this case, everybody has 10 fingers. Well, he was right on 9 fingers and wrong on 1, or right on 7 fingers and wrong on 3. And that way they can sweep the mistakes under the rug and keep the evolution of the program going. But what we're looking at is that in two different environments in these two lectures, that there were different evolutionary pressures, to use that language. There are two different sets of conditions that caused communism to develop differently. And the point we're going to make through the whole thing is that it all kind of has come back together, like I said at the beginning last time, in this sort of witch's brew of everything they've tried, which is part of why, according to the question from the end of the last session, where I said that I was optimistic that if we beat it now, we might beat it for a long time. I feel like they've taken all their eggs and stuck them in this basket of what we're going through now. But they responded to the pressures and the environments that they were in differently, just like any evolutionary situation. And so they took different tracks, and we're going to talk about the Russian and Eastern Bloc. Well, we're not really going to talk about the Eastern Bloc too much, but the broadly Soviet and then the CCP Chinese People's Republic of China section today, which is generally referred to as Eastern Marxism. I would give this other list of alternatives: industrial communism, feudal communism, 20th-century communism, vanguard communism, state communism, or Soviet communism. Communists who don't want to talk too bluntly about what they're referring to have referred to it in the past as actually existing socialism, which they then criticize. Another term that's very frequently used is Marxism-Leninism, with a hyphen between them. So it's now the Marxist religion or ideology and a Leninist delivery mechanism is the way that you would want to look at that. For me, the best terms are going to be industrial communism and state communism. Industrial because of the heavy focus on heavy industrial production, including the industrial production of people. And state because it deliberately seeks to take and use state power to achieve its goal of imposing communism and achieving the communist heaven. So the way that industrial or state communism works, The reason I said that it could be called vanguard communism is because it operates on a belief that some enlightened vanguard, which is the socialist Gnostic elect, the people who they know how we're really socialist, but the stupid proles don't know that. So we need this vanguard to usher us through, usher the everyday people and the backwards people, as they frequently were called, through socialism, through increasingly intense applications of the inversion of praxis, as I mentioned before, which is how the society socializes you. So in other words, if they can increase the amount of state power to force people to be socialist, they can make people generation after generation become more socialist. So what you need is a leadership group that understands that this is how it works and how important it is to basically be, I wouldn't say the good shepherd, but maybe the bad shepherd that pulls people through into communism. So in the terms of this Gnostic religion, where I mentioned the demiurge is the evil demon that constructs the world, in a sense, I said that Marx sees the bourgeois class as a demiurge, a controlling force that imprisons everybody in the world. Well, the industrial communist view would be we can only defeat the demiurge by becoming the demiurge ourself, with the intention to relinquish our ultimate power. So the vanguard state sets itself up as a dictatorship. And in essence, in the religious terms, they are becoming the divine idea as it exists on earth, the embodiment of God, so that we can beat the false God, the evil demon God of bourgeois values, and replace all of that. So they're now going to, in other words, short version, they're now going to make communism happen by force. They're going to beat the demiurge by becoming the demiurge instead. And that way we'll get to Eden. And what actually turns out, communist Eden, by the way, so what turns out is that all of these people turn out to be extraordinarily competitive. They are all competing. Like the Soviet Union, by the time China comes around on the scene, they're all competing to be the first country that can bring in real communism. And everything goes more and more and more sideways as they compete with one another to destroy their populations, to make it work faster so that they can have the bragging rights of being the one who brought Marx's vision to life. Our three primary characters in this lecture are Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, who are not exactly good guys. They're on your little flyer, the ones that have less facial hair. If we had an extra person on there who's not Kamala Harris, it would have to be Klaus Schwab, and he looks like a reptile or turtle. So you can see the progression is from more beard to less beard and hair as communism has evolved. So Lenin's idea, I'm going to give Lenin a lot of credit in some sense here, because he is brutal. Like, let's put this all in qualified terms. He's extraordinarily brutal, but he's way less brutal than the other two, right? And so I would say that the characteristic that Lenin gives is really that bad shepherd model. He's going to use authoritarian discipline and authoritarian guidance to lead the people or the masses into their socialist conversion. When you get to Stalin, that's a different picture. Stalin's just like, no, we're using totalitarian force. He openly was a totalitarian. And like at the time, people didn't realize that was a bad word yet. We're going to hear later that Mussolini also openly called himself a totalitarian. Mao is actually a lot more subtle than Stalin was. It's really communism through brainwashing. And the main technique is actually this guilt-ridden self-criticism where you're constantly beating yourself up for not being socialist enough, and you're being basically pinned into situations where your social and political activity depends on you prostrating yourself to whether it's the cadre or the dear leader or Mao or whatever. And so he's trying to affect personal conversions, which is a little bit different. And so I wouldn't call that a totalitarian environment. And again, this is a linguistic splitting of hairs. The word that I would use for that is totalism, which is that you're in this all-pervasive environment that touches every total part of reality and your life, but you don't have as much of, and this is again a qualified statement because Mao was definitely a brutal totalitarian who had no regard for human life, you don't have as much of that Stalin like, well, you know what, things aren't going the way that we want, so let's fix the farmers by killing 9 million of them. Like Mao didn't do that. He would say, we're going to kill 1% of the population, which turns out not to be 9 million people or whatever. And so Stalin was quite more brutal or more directly brutal. I would say Mao was just flat out disregard for human life, which is it's not really different in end, but it's different in vibe or attitude. I would say the general vibe of the industrial communism that arose after the Bolshevik Revolution is that everything that doesn't represent the enlightened state of socialism or communism is in the way and has to be destroyed or transformed by force, overcome as a matter of fact. That would be that everything that's not fostering socialism and not bringing glory to socialism and not speaking to socialism for the people is an enemy of the people. So that can include people, it can include people with political views, it can include criminals, it can include religion and their adherents, it can be wealth and the people who have it, but it can even be reality itself and nature. Just to give you a taste of this, I'm going to read to you a paragraph from Frank Dikötter's Mao's Great Famine is the title of the book, about how Mao in the 1960s, I guess, or late 50s, when he launched the Great Leap Forward, was thinking about his role with regard to nature. And this is all paralleled in Soviet Union. I just want to give you a taste. So Dikötter, by the way, if you haven't read him, he's written this history, this three-part history called the People's Trilogy, that documents Mao's time in power in China, the 26 or 7 years that Mao was in power. And it's truly eye-opening history, and it's extremely well written. You'll hear how good of a writer he is. Mao, he said, viewed nature as an enemy to be overcome. So you can tell this is going to go badly, right? And this isn't, the Soviet Union wasn't different in this regard. Mao viewed nature as an enemy to be overcome, an adversary to be brought to heel, an entity fundamentally separate from humans, which should be reshaped and harnessed through mass mobilization. War had to be waged against nature by people pitted against the environment in ceaseless struggle for survival. A voluntarist philosophy held that human will in the boundless energy of the revolutionary masses could radically transform material conditions and overcome whatever difficulties were thrown in the path to a communist future. So we're going to do this for the glory of dialectical materialism, and we'll conquer all of nature is the attitude there. He says the physical world itself could be reshaped, hills erased, mountains leveled, rivers raised, bucket by bucket if necessary. Launching the Great Leap Forward, Mao declared that, quote, there is a new war, we should open fire on nature, end quote. So this is really explicitly clear to anybody with any sense that this isn't going to work. But the Soviets did the same thing. There were cases where the Soviets decided they were going to try to move lakes, which just led to the water all going away. There is no lake now, and the people need water. They tried to dig these, grand canals that ended up draining entire water tables, and then didn't even end up being wide enough to support the ships that they needed to run in the canals. I mean, it's all really idiotic, but they wanted to do these huge geoengineering scale projects plus heavy industry and so on to show that socialism had the goods, that socialism could do what capitalism couldn't even do. By organizing the masses bucket by bucket, that they could literally transform the world. And this is partly in line with Marx and partly not, because Marx had a belief that you were supposed to we're supposed to humanize nature, which means that we're supposed to envision how all of nature is supposed to look and make it suitable to our purposes. So that part is in line with Marx. But there are other parts that aren't exactly in line with Marx. But I might just point out real quick, since we're doing this as kind of a whole conference theme, that there's a very able to see what can be unburdened by what has been vibe to we're going to wage war on nature to prove how good socialism is, right? It's the same thing over and over and over again. But here's Marx talked a lot about nature being man's inorganic body. And I would skip this. I mean, it just shows that, Mao was kind of wrong and Lenin and Stalin were kind of wrong. But it's actually important because in the last lecture, we're going to talk about this concept of degrowth and ESG and all of these things that we're dealing with, sustainability that we're dealing with now. So it's good to hear what Marx actually thought about nature. He has this rant in the economic philosophic manuscripts. This is kind of a lot. He says, the life of the species, both in man and in animals, consists physically in the fact that man, like the animal, lives on organic nature. Mind-blowing stuff here, right? And the more universal man or the animal is, the more universal is the sphere of inorganic nature on which he lives. Just as plants, animals, stones, air, light, etc. constitute theoretically a part of human consciousness, so we think about rocks and plants and stuff, so they're part of our consciousness. partly as objects of natural science, partly as objects of art, his spiritual inorganic nature, spiritual nourishment, which he must first prepare to make palatable and digestible. That's where you have to make nature look like it's supposed to look to give the glory of man. So also in the realm of practice, they constitute a part of human life and human activity. Nature, rocks, plants, animals, and so on. Physically, man lives only on these products of nature, whether they appear in the form of food, heating, clothes, a dwelling, etc. The universality of man, notice that's a religious claim right there, appears in practice precisely in the universality which makes all nature his inorganic body. So hold on, what's he talking about? He says when you have feudal lords, the whole feudal estate is actually an extension of his body, and all of his serfs are actually cells in his body. He doesn't literally say cells, but it's the same model. And when you have a kingdom, the king, he has his organic body, and then the whole kingdom is actually operating according to his will. So the whole kingdom is his inorganic body. Well, when man realizes who he really is, all of nature is his, like the relationship of the kingdom to the king, or the plantation to the aristocrat. And so the universality of man appears in practice precisely in the universality which makes all nature his inorganic body, both inasmuch as nature is one, his direct means of life, and two, the material object and the instrument of his life activity. So you can see where this whole sustainability thing really is stuck in Marx. All of nature is his inorganic body, so we're going to have to make it suitable for us. And that's the exact opposite of wage a war on nature, except in this weird, brutal industrial communist where we can break and fix and remold everything the way we want to very directly through industrial practices. He says, nature is man's inorganic body, nature that is insofar as it is not itself a human body. Man lives on nature means that nature is his body, with which he must remain in continuous interchange if he is not to die. That man's physical and spiritual life is linked to nature means simply that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature, and estranging from man one nature and to himself, sustainability and inclusion are the answers to that. His own active functions, his life activity, his estranged labor estranges the species from man. So when we don't understand that we are part of nature and nature is part of us, and it's our responsibility to build it to the glory of socialism and our own purposes, then we are estranging ourselves from our true nature, which is obviously master of the universe. We are as gods, is the message of Marxism. Remember that whole make yourself your own true sun to revolve around yourself instead of religion being the false sun? Yeah. So the industrial communists had this idea that they're going to wage war on nature to prove, just like they're waging war on everything else, to prove how powerful socialism is, and how once you implement socialism with an industrial economy, you can transform anything, man, nature, society, the world, everything, to be suitable. So it's kind of in line with Marx, but it also kind of misses what Marx was about. It's in that brutal, let's force everything way that we're going to see is so typical of industrial communism. Marx goes on in EPM to say, it is just in his work upon the objective world, therefore, that man really proves himself to be a species being. So by working on the world and trying to transform it, we prove ourselves to be communal. And that's what the Soviets were trying to tap into. That's what that's why they have to wage war on nature. That's how they think you're going to do it, is we're going to prove that we're actually socialists, species being, by doing our work to transform nature. And they were going to do it, hard. This production is his active species life. Therefore, this production, nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of labor is therefore the objectification of man's species life. This stuff is really hard to read until you realize that what he's actually saying is this is how we understand ourselves to be human. And human means socialist. For he duplicates himself not only as in consciousness intellectually, but also actively in reality, and therefore he sees himself in a world that he has created. So again, you're the creator. Man is his own creator. Man is the creator of the world, and that's why we have to wage war on nature to prove it to ourselves, and that socialism is the correct belief system because that's what articulated this. So in tearing away man from the object of his production, which is the transformation of nature, therefore estranged labor tears from him his species life. He uses such stupid words. his real objectivity as a member of the species and transforms his advantage over animals into the disadvantage that his inorganic body nature is taken away from him. So I talk a lot about the iron law of woke projection. We can see in Mao and in, like I said, in parallel in the Soviet Union, this war on nature is obviously not going to work. And it very much didn't work. It has that very, 20th century, we can change everything kind of scientism driving it, and we know it's not going to work. We kind of know it's idiotic, but it's grandiose and it's everything else. But the whole point is that it's actually manifesting exactly that his inorganic body nature is going to be taken away from him. Gigantic wastelands were created across the Soviet Union and across China, absolutely fallow land, unproductive land, destroyed mines, like destroyed nature, destroyed rivers, polluted everything. It's just a complete disaster. But the industrial communists took this as a charge to prove to man that he's really human, which is to say that he's really a socialist and, in fact, master of the world, that he is already as gods. The way that the project of industrial or state communism worked is that communism became the state religion. And I really mean that. A lot of people say, oh, it's atheistic. It's very important to realize that they preached atheism, but that was not what was going on. That was to get the other religions out of the way, because the state religion, with the full force of like Inquisition, was the party. There was socialism. And so that evolved, as I want to make the case, must happen in communism, because communism doesn't work. It evolved from, like I said, with Lenin, authoritarian discipline, the bad shepherd, into totalitarianism under Stalin, and then kind of in parallel, and then afterwards in Mao, into this totalism, personal relationship with your transformation, somewhat softer totalitarianism that kind of characterizes how he operated in comparison to the iron fist of Stalin. So the party that did this was called the Bolsheviks. This is a little bit complicated because they went by 3 different names in a very short period of history, around 1917 when they did the revolution. So they called themselves the Bolsheviks. I'm not going to get into the whole history of that term or the Mensheviks and all that, but that was another name for the Social Democrat Party. So let's not let the Democratic Socialists of America fool us. They're communists. The Social Democratic Party was Lenin's party. That's what it was called. And then when they took power, they renamed it the Communist Party. And they set up the Communist International, or Comintern, in Moscow. And they actually believed that this vanguard model, in other words, a conspiracy, actually is necessary, which is that throwback to Babeuf. So it's not going to be that we're going to go among the workers and evangelize to them about the powers of socialism, and they're going to organize themselves. Nope, now we've got to organize a dedicated, basically special forces operation to force them through it, and we're going to conspire for how we're going to do that. So you're seeing this kind of, well, this past idea that Marx rejected, well, let's try that again in a new form. So there's that spiral logic happening again. And so a vanguard party had to be organized to stoke and run the revolution, and then eventually the new government as a dictatorship. And so in 1902, way before the Russian Revolution in 1917, Lenin wrote a pamphlet, or a book really, What is to be Done? It's not a very fun read. It's a lot of him arguing with other Russians that he doesn't like, and it's not clear a lot of times what he's talking about, but there are some clear points. And he makes the point about the need for vanguardism, which basically boils down to the proles are too stupid and too distracted and too bought into capitalism and what little lot they have, or even feudalism, and what little lot they have to want to become revolutionary, so they have to be led through it. This is Lenin in 1902. He says, class political consciousness can be brought to the workers only from without. They will never, this is against Marx, they will never develop it themselves. Their suffering will not give them gnosis in and of itself. It can only be brought to the workers from without. That is, only from outside the economic struggle, from outside the sphere of relations between workers and employers. The sphere from which alone it is possible to obtain this knowledge is the sphere of relationships of all classes and strata, to the state and to the government, to the sphere of the interrelations between all classes. So only these kind of nerds are going to be able to run the government, right? These are nerds, these are intellectuals, philosophers, this is like the old quip about the faculty of Harvard running the country, right? Only the really smart people, only the experts are going to be able to do it. And the vanguard is really the socialist experts. It says, for that reason, The reply to the question as to what must be done to bring political knowledge to the workers cannot be merely the answer with which in the majority of cases, the practical workers, especially those inclined toward economism, mostly content themselves, namely, to go among the workers. So Marx's evangelism to the workers, to awaken them to the crappy lot that they have and to make them socialists, that's not going to work. What is to be done? He says to bring political knowledge to the workers. The social democrats must go among all classes of the population. They must dispatch units of their army in all directions. So you can't even just go among the workers. We've got to hit everybody in society all the time. So you've got to have, as we're going to hear, agitation and propaganda that is going to be directed at every class in society. So you're going to agitate the workers, you're going to agitate the business owners, you're going to agitate the government people, you're going to agitate the racial minorities, you're going to agitate everything so that you have kind of total chaos. And in that chaos, the vanguard is going to come in and sweep in and take power. And so total chaos that sort of feels like what we're living through was Lenin's model. Now, this shepherd class, the vanguard, he actually calls for this in What is to be Done over and over and over again, but I really looked for a couple of good passages to read, and he's actually being really sarcastic a lot of the time, so it's very hard to find good characteristic passages. But I did find one where he said, the national tasks of Russian social democracy are such as have never confronted any other socialist party in the world. We shall have occasion further on to deal with the political and organizational duties which the task of emancipating the whole people from the yoke of autocracy imposes upon us. At this point, we wish to state only that the role of the vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory. So once again, the professors are basically going to run the show. We made the joke last time, scratch a hippie, find a fascist. Maybe it's scratch a professor, find a fascist. Sorry to the professors in the room. But you might have noticed that smart people, when challenged, sometimes get upset. But only the most advanced theoreticians are going to be able to lead this. Now, of course, who are going to be your most advanced theoreticians? They're going to be people like Marx, who wrote theory all day and wouldn't get a job, so they had no practical experience. So what are they going to do? Try to move a lake. Hey, we can do it. Why not? What's to stop us, right? But the problem that he was trying to solve essentially is that they did straight up recognize, especially in these peasant-driven feudal areas like in Russia, that proletarians don't actually organize themselves, and they don't really even want to be organized that much. And they don't actually even want a revolution. They mostly want reforms. They want better working conditions and better living conditions and a little bit fairer shake, but they want to be able to work hard and find dignity in work. And as long as they're not getting cheated, they're kind of happy. So those things have to be overcome in those stupid proletarians who aren't going to do it. So the most advanced theoreticians are going to lead them into, as my Australian friend called it, the blender. So Lenin's vanguard idea, actually, you think, wow, that's pretty clever for him to think it up. No, he didn't think it up. It came from Engels. He stole it from Engels and then just decided his whole program would be this. So this comes from some remarks Engels made in 1874 about the social democratic movement, which I guess Lenin also borrowed from. So this is a little bit long, but here's like the actual explanation. This is the hard part. So I apologize for these long quotes. But the thing is these people won't just write something. They have to spread it across pages. What's really frustrating, I'm not talking about Herbert Marcuse in this lecture, but Herbert Marcuse, every paragraph, go read him, starts with, so this idea tells us, and so which means you have to go read the whole previous paragraph to know what he's talking about. But that paragraph starts the same way. And then the other one, you got to go back 4 pages to figure out what he's talking about, and you can't quote anything succinctly to say what they're actually saying. So here's Engels. He's bragging on the Germans, as he would have done. The German workers have 2 important advantages over those of the rest of Europe. Hitler would have thought that too. First, they belong to the most theoretical people of Europe, and they have retained that sense of theory which the so-called educated classes of Germany have almost completely lost. And this is actually, the reason you're getting a lot of this is I wanted this sentence. Without German philosophy which preceded it, particularly that of Hegel, German scientific socialism, the only scientific socialism that has ever existed, would never have come into being. So there's Engels straight up saying, if we didn't take it from Hegel, it never would have come into being. And that's why Germans are better than everybody. Without a sense of the theory among the workers, this scientific socialism would have never entered their flesh and blood as much as is the case. What an immeasurable advantage this may be seen on the one hand from the indifference toward all theory, which is one of the main reasons why the English working class movement crawls along so slowly in spite of the splendid organization of the individual unions. Due to this advantageous situation, I skipped a lot there of him waffling here. Due to this advantageous situation on the one hand and to the insular peculiarities of the English and the forcible suppression of the French movement on the other, the German workers have for the moment been placed in the vanguard of the proletarian struggle. The main theorists are the vanguard, the nerds. It's not quite Revenge of the Nerds, but it's like the Industrial March of the Nerds or something. How long events will allow them to occupy this post of honor cannot be foretold, but let us hope that as long as they occupy it, they will fill it fittingly. And then he tells us what the vanguard is supposed to do. And by the way, I didn't actually read Engels to find this. Lenin just quoted him for pages straight. This is how they are. It's really frustrating to read these people. So Engels outlines exactly for us what the vanguard is supposed to do. He says, this is Engels, this demands redoubled efforts in every field of struggle and agitation. So not even agitation and propaganda, agitprop. Lenin didn't even come up with that. He just stole it. It's all recycled. I really want you to get the hint that all communism is recycled ideas. Everything we're dealing with now in one form or another, maybe not exactly the same and with different means, came from Lenin. Like it's all there. And Marx and Engels is who he just ripped it all off from. It's all ripped off. It's all just ripped off. So here's what you have to do. It will be the duty of the leaders to gain an ever clearer insight into all theoretical questions. So the most important thing that the political leaders are supposed to do is study Marxism. To free themselves more and more from the influence of traditional phrases inherited from the old world outlook, and to constantly keep, so what is that? That is to see what can be, unburdened by what has been. And to constantly keep in mind that socialism, since it has become a science, demands that it be pursued as a science. That is, that it can be studied. The task will be to spread with increased zeal among the masses of the workers the ever more clarified understanding thus acquired, to knit together ever more firmly the organization of both party and the trade unions. So that's what the vanguard is supposed to do, is study the Marxist religion and become more and more puritanical about it. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what Engels said. That's what Lenin said was the most important thing to know about it and what is to be done. So here's how Lenin commented on it. Thankfully, these are very short. I just pulled 2 sentences. We must go among all classes of the population as theoreticians, as propagandists, as agitators, and as organizers. Community organizers, Barack Obama. The principal thing, this is a second quote, the principal thing, of course, is propaganda and agitation among all strata of the people. So basically, drive everybody crazy with propaganda that agitates them and throws them off kilter and divides them and gets them fighting with each other everywhere at all levels of society all the time. Does it sound like CNN?
Sounds familiar. I agree with NBC. Yeah, we're living it.
So the purpose is to sow agitation and disruption at all levels, everywhere, in order to affect the ideological subversion or demoralization of the entire population. You want the entire population confused about what is and is not true, and you target every single separate class or sector with things that will actually agitate them. Lenin is so just cavalier about saying we're going to use agitation and propaganda over and over and over again. It's a sign of his times. Those are bad words now. Agitprop is not a good word. But it tells you that they felt fully entitled to go irritate people until they could create conditions that were so tumultuous that they could take over power and bring stability, because that's what they were going to do, is go make everything crazy, and then we're going to provide, at least the workers and the peasants are going to get stability, land and bread for everybody, and jobs for the people in the city. So this method, like I just mentioned and kind of joked about, has been employed ever since. Let me tell you about the VIMA. This is a term that I borrowed and I don't know where, so I can't give proper credit. I saw it on social media. But it's an acronym. You can write it down, VIMA, VIMA. Vertically Integrated Messaging Apparatus. That's not my term, but I use it all the time and people think it is. That's what we're dealing with. That's when the politicians, the national news, the local news, the state level news, the influencers, they're all saying exactly the same thing, exactly at the same time, like when all of a sudden, everybody, everywhere, all in a day decided J.D. Vance is weird. And no matter where you turn, no matter what channel, no matter what station, no matter what you look at, newspaper, print, social media, television, you see the same message repeated again and again and again. And look at that. This accusation of weird, right? What is it? That's agitation, because it's irritating to hear it, and propaganda. They're trying to paint a picture of their political enemy. And so the reason that we're all insane and the reason that they're advancing so successfully is overwhelmingly, as my friend James O'Keefe reminded me the other day, he said, the media is everything because they control the VEMA and we don't. They control the vertically integrated messaging apparatus. In other words, they have the Death Star of propaganda, and they're aiming it at our population all the time. I have a hypothesis that I don't know is true, but my guess is if that got shut down, if the fake news media, so to speak, and the manipulation on social media, if they were no longer openly propagandizing us and deliberately propagandizing us, that the majority of the population would normalize and stop feeling like they're going crazy and come back to reality with about 3 months. We are being driven crazy. So the big point is we are not going crazy. We are being driven crazy as a society, not individuals in any particular. And they're doing it because that was Lenin's method of breaking apart a population so that you could overthrow it with a color revolution.
What is a color revolution?
A color revolution, thank you. So just to clarify, a color revolution is when you have foreign influence come in and make it look like it was an internal job, like that a band of radicals or dissidents arose within a country and said, Scotland's not going to take it anymore. We're Scottish and we're mad, but it's really, say, CIA agents doing it. So it's when foreign actors create the conditions for apparently organic revolution in a foreign country. So it turns out that Lenin adapted the communist theory in terms of what is to be done, which he says he returned to Marx, but that's questionable, debatable. And he took all of the communist theory and crammed it into a very, what I called with Hegel, a theosophical statist model. You have very statist model. The state is going to be the center of the whole thing. So state communism would be a fitting name instead of industrial communism, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But the thing is that Lenin was playing a word game, what a surprise, with the word state. So when communists use the word state, they don't even necessarily mean the same thing that we do. That's typical. So he separated the concept of state into two. There's the bourgeois state and there's the proletarian state, and they're not the same thing. Because one doesn't have the enlightened view and one does. And so Leninism, or Marxism-Leninism, Leninism is Marxism built off of this word game. That there's an intrinsic separation between the bourgeois state and the proletarian state, and we're going to destroy the bourgeois state using the proletarian state. That's actually Leninism, Marxism in a single summary. So let me break down the word trick before we talk about how he actually used it, because this A is typical of communists all the time, so I'll give it to you in the kind of abstract form. But he also didn't just do it with the word state, he very famously did it with the infamous word of our time, democracy. Our democracy, Lenin's democracy. So what you do is you start with a word. This is the word trick he's employing. Here the word is state, but we could use democracy equally well. And it's a word that most people generally and vaguely understand. And that's really important because you're not going to ask anybody what it means. You're not going to stop and say, wait a minute, theosophy, what is that, right? You couldn't do it too easily with that word. Not enough people know it. If I said the word democracy, are you going to stop and say, wait, what do you mean by democracy? Like, no, you know, right? That's a word you said since you were a little kid. Everybody knows that word. Nobody's going to show that they're stupid and doesn't know what that word means. So you start with a word that generally people understand, but they don't really have a clear understanding of it. If you put them on a man on the street video and said, okay, so what's the difference between a democracy and a republic? They couldn't do it, right? They don't really know, but they don't know. And then you split it into two pieces here, bourgeois and proletariat. In other words, in general, one is good and one is bad. One is somehow, enlightened and one is backwards, right? Or evil. So it's bourgeois state and proletarian state, or bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy as two different types. So at first, when they speak about it, they make the split clear. He comes straight out and says, well, we talk about the state. Well, that's not a clear idea. Let's talk about it. There's a bourgeois state, but there's also a proletarian state, and they're not the same thing. So at first, they tell you they're splitting the term, But that doesn't last. This is their communist word trick. This is how they mystify people. This is actually the wizardry in action. It's magic spells. Because then what you do next is you delegitimize the original meaning of the word by making it associated with bad things or evil things or stupidity or backwardsness. It's a low-level understanding of what a state is, really. It's an earlier understanding. We've Gnostically moved forward to a higher understanding. Come with us. And then you extol the new version, in this case, proletarian state, as what it is that would lead us to the ideal. So the bourgeois state just reproduces itself and we all get stuck in bad bourgeois values and we all look at all these problems we live in. But on the other hand, the proletarian state doesn't do that. So it's going to lead us out of the wilderness. Same thing with ideal state, the same thing with bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy. And then you take it even further and you say that the good version is leading to the ideal, because this is all German idealism at the end of the day. So you say that proletarian democracy will grow into ideal democracy. And the proletarian state will become the ideal state, which is a communist, stateless, classless society in which the state is withered away. And then after you've mucked up everything and confused people and kind of got them like, wait, there's two and I don't really know what they are, then you stop, if you're them, you stop using the adjectives. It's just state from now on. They mean proletarian state, but they don't tell you that. So you glaze over that part, all confused, not knowing what you just read. In the next part, they're talking about the proletarian state. You think they're talking about what you think the state is, and they're advancing the game. So this is when the Democrats are on TV all the time saying, we're going to defend our democracy. Donald Trump, bad for democracy. Elon Musk, bad for democracy. Joe Rogan, bad for democracy. Everything's bad for democracy. What's democracy? Well, they mean proletarian democracy. They mean sustainable and inclusive democracy. They mean a modified version, and they're not putting the adjective. But the people who know, the people who are bought in, even if they don't know, right? The rank and file woke, they're not real savvy to what's going on with woke. They don't know in the sense that they've been clued in, like, oh, this is a secret cipher in the code and I understand it. They intuit it. They feel it. They know in an intuitive sense what's being talked about. And that's how they actually trick people. You drop the modifiers and you've said the bourgeois state is bad, so we're just not going to talk about that anymore. We're only going to talk about the proletarian state. We don't use low-level, outdated definitions. And then you mock and attack anybody who thinks that the old definition is still true. Wait a minute, no. Democracy means everybody gets one vote. No, that's an old version. We haven't taken into account racial justice yet. You're a racist. That's the general idea of the program. So the proletarian state just becomes the state, and then now they're justified in using the state apparatus, and what most people think that does because they've done a little linguistic switcheroo, and all the subsequent uses of the mystified word are mystified. So the people reading them don't understand what they mean unless they're in on the code or can intuit it. And they, like I said, they really attack anybody who doesn't get it so that they look like the better and smarter people. So I know that was a little bit complicated, but here's what it is. You've got a linguistic train running along the normal definition track, and they come along and they pull the little switch and put it on a new track while people aren't paying attention, and that's how they do it. And all of a sudden they're talking about something else while you think they're talking about the thing that we've all been talking about all along. And this is communist bread and butter. And this is why it's so easy to associate it with what the Bible calls the capital D deceiver, among other reasons. Okay, so he's actually playing, the whole program is built off of a word game about what the state means, so that he can justify taking absolute total power or authoritarian power for him in the state. So again, following Engels, because he's not that original of a thinker, here in Anti-Düring and the Holy Family, Lenin argues that the state is a manifestation and guarantor only of the existing class conflict. The state is what keeps us in the present stage of development. That's why the socialists don't have a state, because they don't want to do that. So what they have is something else. He calls it a semi-state, which is sort of funny. So in State and Revolution, which he wrote in 1917, between the two revolutions in 1917, he said, this expresses with perfect clarity. See how it starts with this? So if you really wanted to explain what you're talking about, we have to go back to the previous paragraph and find out what the hell this is. They all do this, every paragraph. This expresses with perfect clarity the basic idea of Marxism with regard to the historical role and meaning of the state. The state is a product and manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively cannot be reconciled, and conversely, the existence of the state proves that class antagonisms are irreconcilable. So now you've got the society is stuck, and it can't progress to its next quantum leap of evolution, and the state comes into being to manage the problem and keep it in the status quo. So the state is a product of its society that's designed to keep the same exact class antagonisms running. So the capitalist state is designed to keep the capitalist world order in place, which is one of those funny things because it's true, but not that way, right? It's a truth married to a lie. Or the feudal state, the kingdom, is arranged so that the feudal, the aristocracy and the nobility, the noble families keep their power. Well, it's true, but not the way that they mean it, not in the weird conspiratorial way. But what's different is that the socialist state has no such ambitions. Their goal is to get rid of the state entirely. So there's something fundamentally different, and not trying to maintain hegemony, allegedly, but rather enlightened enough to know that the true state at the end has to wither away and sacrifice itself to the liberation of man. That's why revolution is necessary, though, because the state prevents the classes. So here's the role of the state, actually, for Lenin, and he's really clear about this. The antagonisms between the classes would break out into war and revolution naturally, except the state steps in and doesn't let it. So it keeps the current antagonism or conflict of society going, which means in Marx's theory that all of history is a history of class conflict. History isn't going anywhere anymore. There's no progression. So we're back to Teilhard's view of we're moving versus no, we're not. And the state exists to keep us from going to the next stage, except if it's socialist, because if it's socialist, they know better because they're enlightened, and that's why we need the vanguard of the theoreticians and the Harvard nerds who are going to lead us into the next level. And that's actually what he says. He calls the semi-state in the socialist situation for that reason. He says, in the first place, this is also in State and Revolution, by the way. In the first place, at the very outset of his argument, Engels says that in seizing state power, the proletariat thereby abolishes the state as state. So he hangs a lot on that little phrase, abolishes the state as state. So the thing that you destroyed was a state when the proletarians take over after the revolution, but it's not a state anymore. It lost its state-like character because its goal isn't to keep the class antagonisms going anymore. He says, it is not done to ponder over the meaning of this. Generally, it is either ignored altogether or it is considered to be something in the nature of Hegelian weakness on Engels' part. As a matter of fact, Engels speaks here of the proletariat revolution abolishing the bourgeois state, while the words about the state withering away refer to the remnants of the proletarian state after the socialist revolution. According to Engels, the bourgeois state does not wither away, but is abolished by revolution by the proletariat in the course of the revolution. What withers away after this revolution is the proletarian state or semi-state. It's not a full state because it's not actually doing the thing that communists say states do. So notice that there's not only just the word trick. He's actually just used the word trick to redefine state completely as a thing that maintains the current order of society and prevents anything from getting better. That's why you have to have a revolution, and you have to install an enlightened vanguard to lead it, to make sure that it takes to a position where there won't be those same class antagonisms any longer. And so that's why the vanguard is, according to Lenin, meant to produce the world's first ideal democracy that's in by its very nature, in the process of withering away from the moment it comes into existence. Now, you'll notice there's a little paradox here. As I already told you, from Lenin to Stalin to Mao, you actually kind of see a concentration of totalitarianism, particularly from Lenin to Stalin. If you go from the years 1917, when Lenin took power, till 1953, when Stalin died, it was just an accelerating ramp of power being applied by the Soviet state. If you look at Mao, when he took power in 1949, all the way until the Great Leap Forward collapses in 1962, it's just an accelerating ramp of power because it doesn't work. So what you have to do is continue to put more and more and more and more force to try to make it work, while you externalize the blame and blame all of the people who aren't doing it right and punish them to try to keep forcing it to work. But that's allegedly the state withering away of its own accord or something. And in fact, Stalin resolves this paradox, but we'll come back to that when we get to Stalin. So the vanguard is meant to produce the world's first ideal democracy, and what he says is in capitalist society, providing it develops under the most favorable conditions, we have a more or less complete democracy in the democratic republic. But this democracy is always hemmed in by the narrow limits set by capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains in effect a democracy for the minority. That means the rich minority, by the way. Only for the propertied classes, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics, freedom for the slave owners. Doesn't that sound like the way woke people talk? Well, that's Lenin. And so you have that Gnostic construction, right? In a capitalist society, you almost have it. You almost have real democracy. You almost do in the democratic republic, but it's only for rich people. It's bourgeois democracy. So we have to come up with a proletarian democracy in comparison. And what does he say about that? But from this capitalist democracy that is inevitably narrow and stealthily pushes aside the poor and is therefore hypocritical and false through and through, forward development does not proceed simply, directly, and smoothly toward greater and greater democracy, as the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists would have us believe. They're always slinging mud at the people they don't like. No, forward development, remember Teilhard, we're moving versus the people who are not moving. No, forward development, that is development toward communism, forward movement, that is development toward communism, proceeds through the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the vanguard of the revolution, and cannot do otherwise. For the resistance of the capitalist exploiters cannot be broken by anyone else or in any other way. And he goes on to say, and the dictatorship of the proletariat, that is the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors. Its whole purpose is not actually to know the best theory. It is to suppress the people they don't like. So here you have Lenin basically saying, give us power and we'll punish the people you don't like. And that's the model. He says, because of that, the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy, simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the money bags. Doesn't that sound like stuff you hear today, by the way, in our democracy speech? The dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, you stupid anti-vaxxers. The exploiters and the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. Notice the oxymoron there. There's no freedom, there's no democracy where there's suppression, so we have to suppress. That's literally what he said. So doesn't that feel, though, like our lives right now? We got two-tier law. I was going to say two-tier cure again. We've got censorship coming out the yin-yang for the last several years. COVID particularly was bad. Let's not talk about election fraud. That's still not okay. We're not allowed to even ask questions about certain things. We've, of course, had the same with the identity politics. We've had legal attacks on conservatives. They might have tried to shoot Trump. They're trying to deny that that ever happened now. This is what the self-appointed dictatorship of the proletariat is meant to do. And this is what the ruling class that we're dealing with is doing to us. It is all about and for suppression of its powerful enemies who are aligned with maintaining the status quo. Now, as for that part about, you remember I said, does that sound familiar with we'll have the first time we'll have democracy for the poor and not the money bags? And I said, doesn't that sound familiar? Well, here's Pete Buttigieg, Secretary Pete. The world has never actually seen a large-scale, fully functioning, fully inclusive, multi-ethnic, multiracial democratic republic that represented everybody. We've never actually had that all the way, but we could. And I believe that we will have that for humanity if and only if we deliver it here in America. Now, there's a lot we could unpack there, but besides the fact that that's literally exactly the same thing that Lenin said about bourgeois and proletarian democracy, an ideal democracy coming down. But I didn't read this quote. I had it in the original notes, the first draft, and I took it out because I had too much stuff. But Marx at one point famously said that the current society is pregnant with the new society. And I don't remember exactly how he did it. And so the socialists or the vanguard is supposed to be the midwife of the new society, right? So maybe he didn't mean it this way, but Mayor Pete literally said, if and only if we deliver it here in America, right? And that's like, I don't know, let's not be too tinfoil hat, but the fact is that Pete Buttigieg, whose father translated Antonio Gramsci, which is the father of cultural Marxism into English, sounds an awful lot like Lenin, at least there. Not always, but at least there. I mean, it's naked. When they talk about democracy, we're hearing Lenin channeled across a century. So even though his first thing in 1902 was what is to be done, he actually tells us what is to be done here in the middle of 1917 before the main Bolshevik Revolution in the fall, the so-called October Revolution, which took place in November. That's a separate story about calendars that we're not going to get into. He says, what makes this all work? Why is the state so important to Lenin? Why does he care so much? The state is a special coercive force. That's what he says. It is a special coercive force. Engels gives this splendid and extremely profound definition here with the utmost lucidity. And from it follows that the special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, of millions of working people by handfuls of the rich, must be replaced by a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. And that is the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is precisely what is meant by the abolition of the state as state. This is precisely the act of taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, and it is self-evident that such a replacement of one bourgeois special force by another proletarian special force cannot possibly take place in the form of withering away. In other words, there's going to be a revolution. So in other words, we need to have a rebirth ritual for society. A revolution is a rebirth ritual, a lowercase omega point, that's going to lead us on the inexorable path to the omega point of society, which is communism. And to do that, it's necessary to seize power, establish its new thing, a dictatorship of the proletariat, to replace the state as state, and to rule for the manifestation of socialism. So its main role is, again, the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. Its main role is suppression. And we feel that today. So this is kind of funny because it's like, in the Gnostic language, again, they see the bourgeois state as the demiurge that's ordered their lives and imprisoned them in a life they didn't want, and they want to get out of that, and they say, well, here's the way that we transform it. Here's the way we get out of it. We become the demiurge. But it's not a real demiurge because we have different designs. It's a semi-demiurge, which will wither away of its own accord, because that's what evil demons do, is wither away of their own accord, because they have the right views. So this is where Lenin has now laid the seeds for totalitarian communism, which he never quite... Lenin didn't live really long after this, by the way. This was 1917. He died in 1925, plus or minus one. I'd have to look again. Stalin did most of this totalitarian stuff, but he's laid the tracks here very clearly. This is how it's supposed to work. And now Stalin wasn't a real popular character in Lenin's court. They frequently wouldn't call him by his name. It wasn't Comrade Stalin, it was the Georgian. Not Georgia like south of Tennessee, Georgia like over there. The Georgian, or the National Socialist, actually, because he believed that we should build what was called communism in one country rather than international communism. So they often called him the National Socialist, which is a kind of funny term these days. So here's how Lenin kind of describes all this, though. He says, it is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also being a state, and consequently, so he's dealing with the fact that what he said doesn't make any sense. We're going to become the thing we're going to destroy, right? To destroy it. It is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also being a state, and consequently also disappearing when the state disappears. Revolution alone can abolish the bourgeois state. The state in general, that is the most complete democracy, can only wither away. So we're going to abolish the bourgeois demiurge and replace it with the proletarian semi-demiurge. I really like that semi-demiurge thing. But there's got to be a revolution first. And so here's how Lenin describes a pair of points about how the state and the democracy have to operate. He says, here we have a formulation of one of the most remarkable and important ideas of Marxism on the subject of the state, namely the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx and Engels began to call it after the Paris Commune. And also a highly interesting definition of the state, which is also one of the forgotten words of Marxism. That is, the state as the proletariat organized as the ruling class. So now you've dropped the old use of state and you have the new state, which is the semi-demiurge state. This definition of the state has never been explained in the prevailing propaganda and agitation literature, just casually says that's how we communicate, is propaganda and agitation of the official social democratic parties. More than that, it has been deliberately ignored, for it is absolutely irreconcilable with reformism and is a slap in the face for the common opportunists' prejudices and Philistine illusions about the peaceful development of democracy. So that I really wanted to read that mostly for that last part, because they're always talking about preserve our democracy and peaceful in our time. And he says that it's Philistine illusions about a peaceful development of democracy. So that's scary. In drawing from Marx and Engels, Lenin goes on to say the proletariat will use, this is from the Communist Manifesto, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, so robbery and plunder, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. And that's why we call it industrial communism right there. So, like I said, their goal is to literally take over as the demiurge and use it to make the glory of socialism by building socialism as rapidly and vigorously as possible to prove that it actually works. And this is the last Lenin quote. The state is a special organization of force. It is an organization of violence for the suppression of some class. What class must the proletariat suppress? Naturally, only the exploiting class, that is the bourgeoisie. The working people need the state only to suppress the resistance of the exploiters, and only the proletariat can direct this suppression, can carry it out. For the proletariat is the only class that is consistently revolutionary, the only class that has the Enlightenment, right? The only class that can unite all of the working and exploited people in the struggle against the bourgeoisie in completely removing it. So that was a lot of Lenin. The good news is I don't have a lot more Lenin, or really any more Lenin, and that was the first time I've ever taught about Lenin, so I got excited and gave you a lot. Because this is new to me and all the rest of it's not. So this was fun. So what did this get them, right? So this is industrial communism. There's not a whole lot of deep conceptual development in the religion. It's we're going to build a state church and rule by force by becoming the thing we hate in order to destroy it. So it's like a state church. It operates literally with an inquisition model. They're going to go find people who don't believe fervently enough and punish them and try to re-educate them and force them to believe. The point is therefore to force the evolution of man. We're not going to allow the evolution of man or awaken him or lead him to it. We're now going to force the evolution of man, drag him through it until he inhabits a new society. And we're going to do that by forcing socialism on it basically till he learns to like it. We're going to feed you socialism until that's how you think it's supposed to be. And like I said, that's becoming the demiurge to destroy the demiurge, or becoming a semi-demiurge to get around that silly definition. But this is your bad shepherd or forceful shepherd model. This is your shepherd not guiding the sheep, but rather dragging them around on leashes or whatever to make them become the thing they want. And that force, like I said, increases because it has to, because it doesn't work, which means it increasingly creates disasters as it goes, bigger and bigger disasters. I call this industrial communism because they're using industrial methods to transform everything, but that means that they're going to manufacture through industrial processes the new man in their very industrial society. They're going to transform you into socialist man, or the new Soviet man, they sometimes called it, by forcing you, because the state has become the sole manufacturer of everything, including you. Like I said, communism's after your soul, and they were going to directly, Inquisition style, force you to convert and to really believe. And like I said, using Marx's model of praxis and inversion of praxis, this is the inversion of praxis to the maximum force approach. If we can build the socialist society, we'll transform the people until they're socialists. We're going to feed it to them until they believe it and become Marxist-Leninists. The method of authoritarian discipline that Lenin used has got another funny name. It's called democratic centralism. Just let those words stir around in your brain for a minute. That's the proletarian democracy. So what it is that you have a democracy of the people, but only the people that agree with you are the people. Only the people who are communists count as people. Everybody else has something wrong with them and has to be re-educated, which requires maintaining socialist discipline in order to have the fruits of participation in society, or especially political society, or getting into the party. And this is all to be done for your own good and the greater good. The bourgeoisie, on the other hand, is not to be encouraged. It is to be suppressed vigorously by this force, to be made examples of, to teach people why you don't want to have the wrong values. That's also for their own good and for the greater good. We're going to suffer and you're going to be happy about it. That's a Harry Potter joke. And so if you want to participate in this society, you have to at least profess and show signs of outward belief. This became insanely competitive. Obedience becomes competitive in a totalitarian state. And so in China, people would do the most extraordinary things, including killing and eating their own children to prove their loyalty to the state, because it was that important to them to show that they were on board with the program when they got fully bought into it. And they didn't want any of their dark secrets that maybe they thought this wasn't so good, or that they hoarded a little bit of rice to come out, which might get them shipped off to a gulag or beaten or robbed or whatever else. And so society-wide inquisition that's very state-directed in USSR, but in China, it's actually a lot of snitch culture. It's a lot of people telling on people. Everybody's trying to kind of gussy up the ladder of how good of a socialist they are, the different models. And you end up with this massive inquisition or witch hunt society where everybody's turning everybody in, and the state's punishing whoever they can, making examples, setting quotas just to make a point. But because it's communist ideology instead of Catholicism, it's actually way more brutal than the Inquisition was, which wasn't exactly a good time for the people that were put to it. Anything like having wrong political opinions or having slightly more than somebody else was enough to ruin your life. If you had a house that was slightly bigger, they would, like a few square feet bigger, they would kick you out of your house just because it wasn't fair, and you're homeless now. Tough. Doesn't matter. Having 2 pans that you could cook with instead of 1 meant you were rich, and that you might have to have your belongings confiscated and redistributed. Having anything, or the wrong political opinions, or the wrong, like being Christian, was enough to get you massively persecuted. And in particular, very famously under Stalin, you have the heavy persecution of the so-called kulaks. Kulak is a Russian word that roughly means rugged individual. Here in Texas, you guys understand. And so there were actually people who were pretty capable at running a farm or running a village or running an area. And, well, you can't have rugged individuals in the midst of a socialist revolution. So they rounded those people up, killed them, or carted them off to Gulag and Siberian prison camps in USSR pretty vigorously. And that process is called dekulakization. And you think that, well, dekulakization far away. That's some Ukrainian stuff in the 30s under brutal Stalin. But remember that all the small businesses basically got shut down. They were non-essential during COVID. And you see some rugged individuals in America no longer able to provide for their families. Dekulakization is absolutely still happening, mostly through stupid regulatory control in this new model. So this is all totally new. Now you get wacky religious beliefs out of this, like 2 + 2 = 5. That's very famously from 1984 by George Orwell, but it's actually much more, well, not as famously, but very much more prominently from the very early Soviet Union. There were posters when we put this together as videos. I'm sure we'll put the poster in the video here, talking about 2 + 2 = 5 with all the Russian on there. And what it's a little bit of a trick. It's not totally Orwellian, like the state says 2 + 2 = 5, so you have to believe it. Although that's actually kind of tucked in there. It was 2 years of hard work plus 2 years of hard work plus the enthusiasm of the socialist masses would produce 5 years of hard work in 4 years. And because they were going to show the religious and magical power of socialism, how in a capitalist country you would need 5 years of work to do this, but we're going to do it in 4 because of the enthusiasm of the masses. But it's definitely also got the whole, if we tell you black is white and white is black and 2 + 2 = 5, you're going to believe it, or else the Cheka is going to knock on your door and part of your family is going to disappear tonight. What did they do with it? Huge industrialization projects. We kind of already talked about that. That's their war on nature. Big disaster. Industrial communism really, you got to realize it's being brought to a peasant society, which Marx said that's not what's supposed to happen. It's supposed to go to capitalist societies, right? And so these are non-industrial, whereas capitalist societies have already industrialized. So this is actually a program for industrialization. It's just a different program than capitalism for industrialization, and that kind of perspective shift on it is going to be really important. It's how do you end up having a productive industrial state? Well, you can build it up organically and let people get rich by taking risks and building things and owning their own property in capitalism, or you can just force it through this totalitarian model. And they had to prove that theirs worked better than anybody else. And so this led to this motive of using this industrial power to smash capitalism completely at home and abroad, and to compete abroad against capitalism to show that they had better production quotas, which meant that they started, why did especially China during the Great Leap Forward, but also Soviet Union, one of the strategies that was used eventually to beat the Soviet Union, especially with the military, not with industrial production, was to get them to overproduce and bankrupt themselves, because they had to constantly show that they had more and better stuff than the capitalists as kind of a marketing program. So you could get them to just continue to revise their production targets up and up and up and up to higher and higher levels, but because nobody's allowed to fall short, or else you don't have your 2 + 2 = 5 socialist zeal, everybody would just lie, and then they wouldn't actually meet their targets and stuff would just fall apart, and they'd make a lot of inferior quality products. China was particularly bad for that. When they started to push up the production quotas, the quality of the products were so bad that even destitute countries like Albania wouldn't accept them. It was like completely just making garbage just to check off boxes. They were adding water to grain to make it heavier, which just made all the grain rot, so then there's a famine. Lots of stories like that. But they had to prove that they were better at industrializing than the capitalists, because now capitalism and socialism are going to be seen as two models to achieve industrial dominance. And that's in a sense really what the striving of the 20th century America versus USSR kind of conflict was. A lot of the Cold War had military aspects and the nuclear aspect, of course, but it was really this kind of gigantic, weird economic production war to show which country was better at making stuff. But they were trying to industrialize everything, including, turning feudal peasants into industrial laborers, or, industrial scale farmers and big collective farms. And they were using methods of collectivization versus voluntarism. You didn't get to sign up to do this. You were forced to do it in collectives. And I told you guys already what happened when they did the collectives. People destroyed their own stuff. The collectivization is one of the biggest failures of communist policy anywhere it's ever been tried, ever. But the idea was that if you had been reborn, like Marx said, if you had your transcendent transformation of that qualitative change inside yourself, if you were the new man, you would want to collectivize naturally. That's just what people do when they're their true socialist species being. So you can see that the frustration of the people at the top, the super theoreticians, must have been really high, because if people really bought into it like they did, it would work, but clearly it's not. So what's the problem? Well, the problem isn't us, it's obviously the idiot workers who aren't doing it right. So then you twist the screw a little harder on them, and then they get less interested, and they're more They're more famished, they're less able to work, they're weaker, they're sicker, they're having more problems, there are more injuries, there's more accidents, everything's falling apart, they're worried about just getting enough to eat and protecting their kids, and they work even worse. And so what must it be? Well, they must have right-wing values under the surface. And so you start running campaigns and purges to destroy them. So what do? You start killing your productive workforce, just like with the kulaks, and you're in this whole downward spiral the whole time. Industrial Marxism, it turns out, doesn't really work very well. And what did this get them was the question I kind of started this with, is millions and millions and millions of deaths. Not all murders, but tragic side effects of a broken system. Starvation, disease, exposure. I mean, people like literally trading their pants and all of their clothing just to have a tiny amount to eat in some places, and then freezing to death because they didn't have any clothes. That's stories like that all over in China, if you read Dick Hatter's trilogy about how wonderful the tragedy of liberation and Mao's Great Famine were. But there were also deliberate deaths. Dekulakization. The Ukrainian Holodomor is a key example. Stalin decided to make an example of the farmers who could make it, so he just starved the Ukrainians. Nobody knows how many died, 3 million, 9 million, that's the range. Just starved them. I mean, there are stories where people went to Ukraine during the time and they have taken everything. They would take every seed. They would take everything you could possibly eat, the leather off of shoes, and just confiscate it and take it all away so that the people literally had nothing. and they let them starve for a winter, and 3 to 9 million of them died in the greatest breadbasket that the world has because of forced bad agricultural practices and downright theft. So another example of what you get with this idiotic fealty to religion is Lysenkoism, which also led to the starvation and the famines and the killing of people. Lysenkoism turns out is a bad method of agriculture. Trofim Lysenko was the Soviet agriculturalist, and it was his job to figure out how to come up with agricultural methods that matched communist theory and didn't use bourgeois Western science to the glory of socialism yet again. And so you had all of these techniques. It was all holistic. You had techniques like planting and farming according to Marxist theory. There's some reports that they actually read communist theory to the seeds and the plants to make them understand how to work collectively better. But techniques like close cropping, where you would pack as many plants into a small area as possible so that they would share resources because of the need to share that would be put onto them by the condition they were in. Or deep plowing, the deeper the roots go, the better the plant will be. So they would plow literally sometimes 2 or 3 meters, so I know we're Americans, 10 feet deep and put the seeds to try to make it work. The Trofim Lysenko said that if you gave him long enough to coach the oranges in communist theory and how valuable it is, he could get the oranges to grow in Siberia. Turns out that's not true. So Lysenko and Lysenkoism actually is based off of the same bogus model of evolution that we read about at the very beginning of the workshop. The Lamarckian pick up traits as you go, group evolution together, transform to a higher quality thing under the right conditions. He had the same bogus transformative view of religion that the United Nations is going to coordinate for the world, allegedly. So this is global Lysenkoism, is what I read from the United Nations at the beginning here in the first lecture. But the idea is that all of it is going to have to be spiritual advancement of the whole through individual advancement of the parts. And so you put the individuals, whether they're plants or people, in view of what the whole goal of the whole society is, and you get them hopped up on the vision of the society, and then you transform the parts to transform the whole, and drive an evolutionary project in that direction so that we eventually become a higher spiritual being. So like corn could become rye, and rye could become wheat, and if it was put under the right conditions, the oranges would grow in Siberia. This is the agricultural version. Or that you could basically beat and starve workers into working harder, which turns out doesn't work very well. All this actually selects for, speaking evolutionarily, is obedience. Obedience, cowardice. In China, they said that if you didn't steal, you died. If you couldn't steal, you died. So who are you selecting for? You're selecting for cowards who won't speak up, obedient people, people who will turn in their neighbors, treacherous, duplicitous people, thieves. You're basically selecting in your society, not just maybe genetically, but for values that are exactly the opposite of every value you actually want to build a productive, healthy society where people want to live. Because they had to show that the industrial production of the new man could be the industrial production of the new world that everybody would want to go along with. And of course, they had a huge propaganda campaign. They would bring foreign people over and show them how well everything was working on guided tours of the best places and feed them great parties and all this, and send them back. And, oh no, Soviet Union's going great. Everything's wonderful there. China is the model for the future, and propagandize to the rest of the world to get support. Now, because this didn't work, they had this thing called the Gulag. Now, because we are modestly, and I'm very strict about that now, I used to say rather well, no, we are modestly educated on the Nazis and therefore concentration camps. We think that the Gulags are concentration camps. They kind of are. They did concentrate people there and make them do work, but they are not concentration camps. They are re-education camps. The point of the Gulag was to feed you socialist theory and to teach you the value of work by making you work on the hardest projects of the Soviet Union. You didn't know the value of the work for society, so we're going to send you off and force you to do it for 10 years in brutal conditions in Siberia, or out in the gold mines of Western Russia, or moving a lake, or digging a canal that doesn't work. The point of the Gulag is a re-education camp. And it became a necessity of the vanguard project, because the vanguards had all the high theory, but so the party had the theory, but all the idiot masses didn't understand why they had to do this. And they could see, some of them were old enough to remember, it was better before this. And they had to re-educate all the kulaks out of their rugged individualism. You don't take care of yourself and your own and your family. You take care of the society. You take care of everybody. But you also had to punish dissidents, and you also had to have this constant fear in the population that you'd get sent off to gulag. But this was kind of like this concentration of the inversion of praxis. Is that like the whole society is being socialist, so we're going to force people to be socialists that way. But this is special courses. Like this is extra, tutoring after school, but you live there for 10 years and do brutal work to learn the value of work to transform you while you read communist theory or have it read to you over propaganda speakers all the time. Because they wanted to create the value of working for the people or for the masses. Of course, if you want to read about this in grotesque and grueling detail, I recommend Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which is 1 billion pages long and really rough reading. But very eye-opening and insightful. Frankly, as bad as stuff happened in Mao's China is, and as bad as stuff has happened in some other places, with the possible exception, honestly, of what happened in Cambodia when they went communist, the Soviet experiments the Cambodians were just brutal and just killing people, 1/4 of their population. Brutal, nasty, awful ways to die. The Soviets were re-educating people, and their experiments in re-education are without parallel in evil in human history. They were easily the worst things that human beings have ever done to other people, particularly in the Eastern Bloc, which is why that was worse than Russia, I don't know. But I don't know if you've ever heard of Romania's Pitești prison. I encourage you with some hesitation to look up the Pitești prison experiment. I will not tell you about it. If you read about it, you will not stop thinking about it for the rest of your life. It was an experiment of about 300 to 400 Christians and Jews, and the goal was to break them of their faith by any means necessary. Let's just put it this way. You are not allowed to die in Pitești. You are not allowed to die. It was so bad, people would try to bite the veins out of their wrists so they'd pull all their teeth out to keep them alive. And they did everything they possibly could to disabuse them of their faith. And what they found is, maybe this is a tremendous testament to human spirit, for most of them they couldn't do it. Most people kept their faith. And they died of, disease or injury or infection or whatever eventually. So state communism is brutal, and it is the de facto official religion, state religion of an industrial or state communist state. Other religions, therefore, had to be crushed completely, so you have tremendous religious persecution. They called it state atheism, but there was also state communism. State atheism is just a beginning, and Marx laid that out. Everybody gets this confused. They think, well, communism was atheistic. No, communism is theosophical, but you have to get real religion out of the way and replace it with this new communist religion, at least if you're going to do it by the brutal direct method of Soviet Union. Atheism is just a starting place. It's like blank slate, so you can build the communist religion on top of what's left. And so Marx, in the economic philosophical manuscripts, explained it. He said, the positive transcendence of private property is the appropriation of human life, is therefore the positive transcendence of all estrangement. That is to say, the return of man from religion, family, state, etc., to his human, which is social existence. Religious estrangement occurs as such only in the realm of consciousness, of man's inner life, but economic estrangement is that of real life. Its transcendence therefore embraces both aspects. It is evident that the initial stage of the movement amongst the various peoples depends on whether the true recognized life of the people manifests itself more in consciousness or in the external world, is more ideal or real. Communism begins from the outset with atheism, but atheism is at first far from being communism. Indeed, the atheism is still mostly an abstraction. The philanthropy of atheism is therefore at first only philosophical, abstract philanthropy, and that of communism is at once real, directly bent on action. So they weren't atheists. They had a completely different religion. They had to be transformed into communists, but you just had to get the other religions out of the way. This isn't the same thing. Communism is a replacement religion for whatever other religions were there. Russian Orthodoxy for the Soviet Union, overwhelmingly, but not only. So atheism was just considered a precondition for forcing people to adopt communism. It's not a voluntary condition. Of course, he's had a lot to say. Everybody's heard his famous opium of the masses thing about religion being the opium of the masses. Well, a lot of people haven't heard more of that. We listened to a little bit earlier with the revolving around of the true sun. Well, that comes from his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which he wrote in 1843 at the end of the year and published in January or February of 1844. And he said, "For Germany, the criticism of religion has been essentially completed, and the criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism." So you can't even do criticism until you get religion out of the way. Why? Because religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. So you don't actually feel your actual suffering. You ignore your suffering through your faith. God can get me through this, or whatever. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. That's the full paragraph in which that appears. Then he goes on to say the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people. That's what religion is, the illusory happiness. You fake yourself out about how bad life is with your religion. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. So if the Soviets could blast you out of your religion, now you're going to have to build a better life. You can't just rely on God to make sense of why things are bad. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call them to give up a condition that requires illusion. So if you get rid of them pretending religion makes it okay to suffer, that their life isn't perfect, then they're going to say, to hell with this, we're going to fix it. That's what he's actually arguing is why you've got to get rid of religion. Criticism, he says, has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that man shall continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation, but so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. The criticism of religion disillusions man so that he will think, act, and fashion reality like a man who has discarded his illusions and regained his senses so that he will move around himself as his own true sun. Religion is only the illusory sun which revolves around man as long as he doesn't revolve around himself. And that's what they were trying to force into people in industrial communism. First step to build the new communist faith was obliterate their existing religion, which, like I said, in Russia was primarily Orthodox Christianity, Russian Orthodox, and Judaism. Now, a lot of people are like, the Jews? Marx was a Jew. They're Jews. It's all the Jews. Have you ever heard what Marx had to say about the Jews? I don't really have time for this. Let's just talk about Marx and the Jews. What did Marx say about the Jews? So in 1843, 5 years before he wrote the Communist Manifesto, he wrote an essay called The Jewish Question. And here's what he said. Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of the religion in the real Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical needs, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Very well then, emancipation from huckstering and money, consequently from practical real Judaism, would be the self-emancipation of our time. An organization of society which would abolish the preconditions for huckstering, and therefore the possibility of huckstering, would make the Jew impossible. His religious consciousness would be dissipated like a thin haze in the real vital air of society. In the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. Does that sound like a friend to the Jews? This is no isolated fact, Marx said. The Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish manner, not only because he has acquired financial power, but also because through him and apart from him, money has become a world power, and the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. That means chasing money, trying to get rich. The Jews have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. So the Jews have now ruined the Christians and made them chase money as their real God. Christianity sprang from Judaism, he said. It has merged again in Judaism. From the outset, the Christian was the theorizing Jew. The Jew is therefore the practical Christian, and the practical Christian has become a Jew again, all meaning chasing money. What in itself was the basis of the Jewish religion? Practical need, egoism. The monotheism of the Jew, therefore, is in reality the polytheism of the many needs. The polytheism which makes even the lavatory an object of divine law. Practical need, egoism is the principle of civil society, and as such appears in pure form as soon as civil society has given birth to the political state. The god of practical need and self-interest is money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, in the face of which no other god may exist. Now, this is really Karl Marx. This is not Adolf Hitler. Okay? Money degrades all the gods of man and turns them into commodities. Money is the universal, self-established value of all things. It has, therefore, robbed the whole world, both the world of men and nature. There's inclusion and sustainability, by the way, of its specific value. Money is the estranged essence of man's work and man's existence, and this alien essence dominates him, and he worships it. The God of the Jews has become secularized and has become the God of this world. The bill of exchange is the real God of the Jew. His God is only an illusory bill of exchange, the view of nature attained under the domination of private property, and money is a real contempt for and practical debasement of nature. In the Jewish religion, nature exists. It is true, but it only exists in their imagination. So let's just dispense with pretending that Karl Marx or Marxism is friends to Jews, because it really, really, really isn't. So smashing religion in the Soviet Union didn't work very well. Most Russians, it turns out, retained their belief in God, even if quietly and privately. Mainline churches basically lost their way. They got co-opted into what was called the registered church that was actually run by the KGB to preach Soviet propaganda and agitation. Minority and independent churches were viciously persecuted, and people were sent to gulag or executed for practicing. There's a film called Beneath Sheep's Clothing that I'm in that came out today, literally today, like a couple hours ago, that actually explores the history of the church and Soviet Union and its comparisons to what's going on here, and also in education. So you can see that for more information. Now, brutality under Lenin is nothing to brutality under Stalin. I'm not really going to say a lot about Stalin, but I have to make a couple points. He was all about total power, right? A total surveillance state and total control over the people. Now imagine though, this was the 1930s, 1920s at the beginning, 1940s. Imagine how crappy their total surveillance state was compared to now. Camera on every corner, I mean the whole thing. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but there's 5 pounds of copper in every one of those cameras. Just saying. Stalin shifted the idea of transitioning to socialism or communism into a totalitarian project. The Holodomor, of course, is maybe the best example, where he decided to make an example of the kulaks, so he killed 3 to 9 million of them, and the New York Times ran cover for him and wrote, the headline was "Russians Hungry, Not Starving." That was by Walter Duranty, and he got the Pulitzer for it. In case you wondered if, the New York Times has lost its way. No. It's been bad a long time. His goal was to literally transform Soviet society as fast as possible through rapid and vigorous industrialization, and ruled with an iron fist to do it. And that literally just increased until he died in 1953. In his 1933, so this is Stalin, Lenin's dead, about a decade, almost a decade at this point. In his 1933 plenum report to the Central Committee regarding the first 5-year plan, here's what Stalin had to say about how he had moved away from Lenin's position. He said, "A strong and powerful dictatorship of the proletariat is what we need now in order to scatter the winds of the last remnants of the dying classes and frustrate their thieving designs. Some comrades have interpreted the thesis about the abolition of classes, the creation of a classless society, and the withering away of the state as a justification of laziness and complacency, a justification of counter-revolutionary theory and the extinction of class struggle and the weakening of the state power. Needless to say, such people cannot have anything in common with our party. They are either degenerates or double dealers and must be driven out of the party." So there's your purges. Now here's the money line from Stalin. This is super important. "The abolition of classes is not achieved by the extinction of the class struggle, but by its intensification. The state will wither away, not as a result of weakening the state power, but as a result of strengthening it to the utmost, which is necessary for finally crushing the remnants of the dying classes and for organizing defense against the capitalist encirclement that is far from having been done away with as of yet and will not soon be done away with." The Strength of the state has to increase to its maximum, and then the state will wither away. It's like you have to become maximum semi-demiurge to actually become semi-demiurge or something. So as a result of fulfilling the 5-year plan, we have succeeded in finally ejecting the last remnants of the hostile classes from their positions in production. We have routed the kulaks and have prepared the ground for their elimination. This is the year after the Holodomor, so that's what he's referring to. Such are the results of the 5-year plans in the sphere of struggle against the last detachments of the bourgeoisie, but that is not enough. The task is to eject these have-beens from our own enterprises and institutions and make them harmless for good and all. So not a nice guy, right? But really want to focus in on that idea of destroying your enemies utterly is the path to success, which is a downward spiral of destruction and purges, and that the state will wither away as a result of attaining the maximum power. That is a religious belief, a cult religious belief, if I've ever heard one. I'm the guy in charge, give me more and more power, and I'll bring you to heaven. That's literally what he's offering. I will unburden you from what has been by giving me all the power. Only absolute totalitarianism could possibly transform man and society, in other words. Well, why do you have to have absolute power? First of all, it's a logical conclusion of Lenin's program, since communism doesn't work. But more importantly, the reason that you have to have absolute power is you have to be able to completely transform the minds of people. So you have to have power over every aspect of their life so that even their thinking changes. So that even that which is hidden within their skull is brought under the dominion of your powers. And that's only possible when you have absolute power, or absolute demiurge power, actually. The reason that this is because there's no path to communism. You cannot get there from here, you cannot get there from there, you cannot get there from anywhere. You cannot get them on a train, you cannot get there on a plane. You cannot get there, Sam I am. It is not possible to get there. Because what this actually is, what communism actually is the Pygmalion myth from Greek mythology rewritten. In fact, you can see that in Rousseau having rewritten it. You can see that in George Bernard Shaw rewriting it as My Fair Lady. The socialist dream is Pygmalion. So in Pygmalion goes off and he goes to the temple, probably the temple of Aphrodite, that's his girl, and there's the prostitutes at the temple, so he decides that he hates women. He becomes a man going his own way in an instant because there's prostitutes at the temple. So he goes home and he decides he's going to be a sculptor with all of his free time now that he's not chasing chicks. And he sculpts the perfect woman, the perfect statue of the perfect woman. And then he falls in love with the statue that he so meticulously carved to perfection. And he takes himself over back to the temple of Aphrodite and he makes a sacrifice and makes a wish in his heart that the statue was his wife, and he comes back to find the statue is alive. This is the thing. So with communism, you're going to carve away the evil parts, the bourgeois parts of society with increasing totalitarian force if necessary. You're going to cut away until you've got the perfect simulation of a communist society, and then Aphrodite will propitiate you and give you your wife as a statue. Except the act of magic never occurs, because magic's not real. And therefore, communism never actually emerges. The state never actually withers away. And the Pygmalion myth that the whole thing is based off of actually tells you why. Because that's a fine and dandy myth, but Aphrodite doesn't actually bring socialist societies to life. So it turns out that all this failed so catastrophically that Stalin turned out to be probably the biggest villain in history. It really blew up his reputation. And it changed communism forever. All the communist states even had to change their program because Stalin was so bad. But that didn't happen until 1956, which was 3 years after he died in 1953. But the whole point is to force this same evolution we've been talking about at the absolute deepest level possible. Now, an important feature of the Soviet Union I didn't mention yet is anti-imperialism. Lenin said that the absolute maximum presentation of capitalism is imperialism. You're going to make an empire to conquer the world. That's probably because he was deeply informed by British agents who were running an empire program. I'm just suggesting. Tinfoil hat time. And so he had this idea, he wanted to advance Trotsky's idea of a world revolution, Lenin's idea was a world revolution, Trotsky's idea was permanent revolution, which is that each country, one after another, has to have a revolution. It's not a permanent revolution here. It's once we get the revolution going here, we have to get a revolution going there, and there, and there, and there, until the entire world's permanently being swallowed up in a revolution, until we finally get there. It also actually fits with Stalin's idea of communism in one country, which got him the name National Socialist, because the idea was that the empire from without had to be resisted and defeated. So there's enemies outside and enemies inside everywhere. But the idea is that the empire has to be the big thing that's the big boogeyman that they're actually going to defeat. And this is actually, why is that relevant? Like, this sounds like a weird tangent that we're not going to talk about. Because that led to Lenin's program of agitprop going out not just to all the classes, but to all the other backwards countries, namely Vietnam, Central America, South America, the Middle East. All of these liberation movements were all Soviet constructions and plants all around the world to start destabilizing the planet to make way for more revolution and the eventual destruction of the West. The Middle East is particularly interesting because the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was a direct Soviet creation, which gave birth to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which we are now still dealing with to this day in not such friendly ways. That was all Soviet agitation to create massive unrest in the Middle East to cause problems for Western nations and to plant communism in their own contexts all over around the world. So how they fought imperialism was they went around and agitated colonial nations and nations with religious or ethnic conflicts and tried to convince them that socialism was the actual way that would undo that. But you get to do it your own way. We'll help you have revolutions in your country and take power, which is what the bands of dissidents actually wanted. And what this did was created this kind of weird Southern Marxism. We're talking about Eastern and Western, but a Southern Marxism, which gave birth to liberation theology in South America through the corrupted corners of the Catholic Church that they had infiltrated, which creates not just this East-West battle, or the fancy word for a battle in Marxism is an East-West dialectic of Marxisms, but now you have a North-South one. So North America, Europe have impoverished the South. We've done climate change and damaged the South, and we've stolen their minerals and resources, so we owe them reparations in the form of whether migration or whatever else. Or monetary restitution. And they created a massive amount of global conflict by going around and planting communist, anti-imperial liberation movements throughout the world. Now, an important part of their expansionism in the Soviet Union, though this is more of a Lenin thing, was the Eastern Bloc. And the Eastern Bloc, I don't want to talk about as the Eastern Bloc. I mentioned Romania, and that's as far as we're going with that because A, we really don't have time, but B, I want to talk about what it caused in Europe, which was a reaction. The Eastern Bloc is qualitatively, there's lots of interesting history, we're not shading over any of it, but qualitatively, the industrial communist model is still happening. It's still roughly the same in the idea world. But what happened was lots of Europeans did not like communism coming to their countries. And they tried to figure out how to fight communism, and they banded together. They formed, as the Italians call it, fasces or fascio, bundles of sticks. It's like, if I had like a little twig and I tried to put an axe head on it and I swung it, it would just flop and break the stick. But if I got a bunch of sticks and put some, twine or whatever and tied them together and put the axe head in that, man, I could chop down all my enemies. Fascism is a bundle of sticks. It's the people banding together primarily to fight against communism, as a matter of fact. And the encroachment of the Soviet Union into Europe through the Eastern Bloc and then further Spain, Italy, and so on, East Germany, led to the rise of fascist movements. You should read Mein Kampf sometime. Guess what he was mostly mad about? Yes, the Jews. Very mad at the Jews, also the liberals, basically everybody, as a matter of fact. But who he really hates are the Marxists. And actually, the reason he hates the Jews, he says it right in the middle of the first few chapters, is because he one day realized that all the Marxists that he hated so much were all Jews. Aha, it must be the Jews. And that's when he turned on the Jews. He was like, Germans aren't Jews. Read Mein Kampf. He actually says it. He fought with the Marxists every day. He hated them so much. Then one day I realized they're all Jews. That's like chapter 3. It's very clear. So fascism arises as a reaction to communism. So it's actually like an extension of communism, but in reverse. It's like the anti-communist communism. It's actually kind of how I want to say it. Because nobody has like a really clear understanding. It's this huge debate as to what constitutes fascism. In fact, one of Mussolini's pillars, when he laid out what is fascism in the book called The Doctrine of Fascism, he explicitly, one of the pillars is anti-Marxism. This is straight up. To be a fascist, you have to hate communists. So they're the real anti-communists, just like the communists are the real anti-fascists, and now you have a pointless dialectic of people fighting with one another that doesn't get us anywhere. So it's roughly a communist model. It's still a totalitarian model that is being used to fight against communism. It just uses different values as its core values rather than liberation and social justice and blah, 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 radical equality. It's loyalty, austerity, never having a good time in life. I mean, that's like literally, Mussolini's like the fascist will never enjoy himself. It's really an austere, brutal, miserable existence, but it's also an extremely spiritual movement. But here's a big point. Now, this is a little fancy terminology. Marx claimed that communism would be the negation of capitalism. So you negate capitalism, you give its opposite, which is socialism, and when socialism negates itself and withers away, you get communism. So it's the negation of the negation. That's not right. Fascism is the negation of capitalism. You start with a capitalism, you hit it with a communism as its negation, and you end up with fascism. So in other words, communism turns capitalist place as fascist. Because nobody knows how to deal with the relentless attack of the communists when they come, and they never give up, and they lie and they cheat and they steal and everything else, and nobody knows what to do. So fascism, not communism, is the actual second turn. We don't get Pygmalion's statue coming to life, we get fascism. You don't get, Pygmalion doesn't come home and find his statue come to life as his bride. He comes home and finds Mussolini. Because fascism, not communism, is the second turn of the Marxist dialectic applied to a capitalist society. So, remember when Marx said that it would either cause a revolution or the common ruin of both classes? He wasn't wrong there. You don't get communism by applying communism. You either repel it or you end up getting one of communism or fascism. You end up in these two ditches. You get to pick your hell. Of course, the communists think that communism is heaven, and the fascists think that fascism is heaven, but they're both part of the same theosophical model. Kind of a very important difference is that communism has that weirdly self-sacrificial Christ-like figure for the state. Fascism is not like that. The state is God, and he's always God, and he's going to be God forever. He's God the Father, not God the Son. And it's a very different kind of mode. You have this very patriarchal, powerful, not self-sacrificing Lamb of God kind of vibe to the fascist thing. So this is all extremely visible if we actually read Mussolini instead of me waffling about it from the Doctrine of Fascism, which he wrote in 1933. The fascist state is a higher and more powerful expression of personality as a force, but a spiritual one. There you go. Fascism is a religion. It sums up all the manifestations of the moral and intellectual life of man. Fascism, in short, is not only a lawgiver and a founder of institutions, but an educator and a promoter of spiritual life. It aims at refashioning not only the forms of life, but their content, man, his character, and his faith. To achieve this purpose, it enforces discipline and uses authority, entering into the soul and ruling with undisputed sway. That's fascism. And anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state, which stands for the conscience and the universal will of man as a historic entity. It's the same program. They're transforming man into a different model of the exact same thing. Fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and the individual within that state. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian. And there it is, word for word. He didn't know that's a bad word, so he said it. In the fascist state, a synthesis and unit inclusive of all values interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. A nation, as expressed in the state, is a living ethical entity only insofar as it is active. Inactivity is death. Therefore, the state is not only authority with a capital A, which governs and confers legal form and spiritual value on individual wills, but it is also power, which makes its will felt and respected beyond its own frontiers, thus affording practical proof of the universal character of the decisions necessary to ensure its development. Sounds like the whole projects of huge industrial building in order to prove that their program works better than other programs, because it's the exact same thing. This is industrial communism turned inside out. Thus, the state equates itself to the will of man, whose development cannot be checked by obstacles, and which, by achieving self-expression, demonstrates its infinity. So fascism is idolatry of the state. A lot of people know it for being corporatism, the fusion of corporation and state. They let the big corporations kind of run everything and make money, but it's all to the glory of the state. You have to have the right values or you don't get to have a corporation. So you get a corporate oligarchy, which sounds an awful lot like today. So you could call it today in modern language a public-private partnership. And that's the main characteristic that communism is using today, as we'll talk about in the last lecture. So fascism has to be thought of as the outcome of communist provocation. It's an extreme outcome. If they push you over the edge, you end up in a fascist ditch. As Hitler said it, in fact, so you get to quote Hitler here, he literally adapted his methods from the Marxists. He said, this is after he talks about how much he hated fighting with them. Thus, I finally discovered who were the evil spirits leading our people astray. You can guess who it was, but he'd already identified the Jews with the Marxists. The sojourn in Vienna for 1 year had proved long enough to convince me that no worker is so rooted in his preconceived notions that he will not surrender them in face of better and clearer arguments and explanations. Gradually, I became an expert in the doctrine of the Marxists and used this knowledge as an instrument to drive home my own firm convictions. I was successful in nearly every case. The great masses can be rescued, but a lot of time and a large share of human patience must be devoted to such work. So that's what we get with fascism, is that it is the inversion of communism, but basically the same thing. And I'm going to skip over some fun parts so we can talk about Mao, even though we are almost out of time. Kind of an important character, right? And it's really hard because there's two Maos. Mao should have his own lecture tomorrow morning, but so should a lot of things. So Mao Zedong's CCP communism should be called the People's Communism. It's not as industrial, but at the beginning, in 1949 when he takes power, it's very industrial. I'm going to call that Mao 1.0. Then he gets thrown out of power after the Great Leap Forward in 1962, and he comes back into power in 1966 with the Cultural Revolution, where he stays until he dies in 76, and that's what I'm going to call Mao 2.0. So his main goal was to actually be the pride of the world and usher in actual communism first. And so he was going to blow the Soviet Union out of the water with his very large, very backwards peasant society that he was going to do. And so he introduced not this idea of this grand totalitarian force, but this new thing of continuous revolution, which is what we have in the West, continuous revolution. As soon as any aspect of the revolution finishes, that was one phase of the revolution. You establish socialism in 1949. The next phase of the revolution is building socialism. The next phase of the revolution is cleaning up business. The next phase of the revolution is whatever it is. So there's a continuous rolling revolution. There's always, every year, every other year, there's a new revolution. And it doesn't stop. Phase after phase after phase. They do have 5-year plans, but it's not like we're going to build this and we're going to build that like the Soviet Union. We're going to have another revolution, and it's going to be the military every time. We're the army taking over every aspect of society, transforming for socialism, not literally military campaigns, but he mobilized workers, farmers, peasants, everything, like they were army regiments to go out and, whatever it was, irrigate fields, destroy crops or something, fail. He wanted to build socialism, so he put out a program called Walk on Two Legs. China would walk on two legs. That means he was going to not just develop the heavy industry like in Soviet Union to prove there's power in steel and heavy industry. In military, they were also going to develop light industry and agriculture at the same time. So they were going to do everything all at once, which guess how this ends? In the greatest mass death in history is how this ends. And to do this, he developed what is called the mass line dialectic. So when we all have the new current thing that we all say, all the NPCs say the same thing. J.D. Vance is weird. Kamala Harris was always our candidate. I'm with her. Whatever the new thing is, that's called the mass line. The idea is that it's a dialectic between the government and the people. What are the people wanting to say? And the government figures out a way to take that and make them say it in a direction that the government wants them to go. And then everybody's supposed to say it everywhere all at once by putting out a mass propaganda campaign everywhere. So now he gets to sell himself as unlike the Soviet Union, we're a communism that listens. We're listening to the people, but they take what the people tell them and direct it into Mao Zedong thought and other programs that the Communist Party wants and needs. This method, though, of the mass line is actually kind of a precursor to what George Soros calls reflexivity, although there's much more to that story. After he took power, he invented the march through the institutions. Right after he takes power in 1950, he does a march through education and completely purges all the teachers to have new education. In 1951, he does this 3 antis program to purge the government: anti-corruption, anti-waste, anti-bureaucratization. In business, in 1952, the 5 antis, 3 wasn't enough. You need 5 antis, the WUFON, anti-bribery, anti-theft of state property, anti-tax evasion, anti-cheating government contracts, anti-stealing economic secrets. Then he had a large Halt Han Chauvinism campaign where he basically built critical race theory, which is actually built off of Lenin and Stalin's idea of diversity, which we'll talk about later, tomorrow. And the goal was he then had a campaign of remolding all the intellectuals. So one institution after another: education, business, government, or I guess I did those backwards, government, business, on down the line, all the way through all the intellectual classes. Everybody was going to be remolded. And these were all given vaguely, so they were really just gigantic justifications for terror campaigns called purges. You didn't know who was going to get rounded up, but there was a quota. They had to get enough people rounded up. So they were looking for people, and anybody who was slightly off was getting sent off to the countryside to do hard labor, or sent to a prison to get re-educated, or 1 out of 1,000 frequently would be the number, would just get shot. He said if it's fewer than 3 out of 1,000, the people won't revolt. He also said if you don't steal more than 1/3 of their food, they won't revolt. It was a complete disaster. This culminated, I'm kind of glazing over Mao 1.0. This culminated in the Great Leap Forward. Now, of course, we have to think of our Great Reset. Resets go backwards, not forward, so it's a Great Leap backwards. Build back better. That was a question earlier, right? That's where I knew that joke went. The Great Leap Forward, he was going to show the world that he could maximize grain production, maximize heavy industry and steel production, and get the numbers off the charts, and meanwhile, maximize exports. So while he's creating the biggest famine the world's ever seen, he's also increasing exports year after year after year. You can just work out on your fingers how that worked out. It turns out that what they said was that it was correct on 9 fingers and wrong on 1, but that 1 killed 100 million people. His method was different, though. It was brainwashing. The goal actually was to make you want to fit in with the new society of China and to make it miserable if you didn't. Mao's main program was to create what I have started to refer to as opt-in tyranny. It wasn't very opt-in then. It wasn't soft. Like there were purges, people were getting rounded up and beaten and so on. But if you went along with the program, you got a class designation of red and things went relatively better for you, especially if you were in a city. If you did not go along with the program, you got a class designation of black and things went really badly for you. So he made a pressure campaign to make people want to reform themselves, to criticize themselves on how they failed to live up to the communist religion. And this is a changing of hearts and changing of values program. It's brainwashing, like I said. Instead of just using force and coercion, there was less of that and violence. It was through criticism, self-criticism, and struggle session. And this is the key evolutionary advance in communist praxis that happened and thought that happened under Mao. He had his, what I call politics of compliance, which is an evolution of Lenin's United Front program, where everybody would say the same thing at once, and it was called Unity, Criticism, Unity. He said this democratic method, this is Mao, of resolving contradictions among the people was epitomized in 1942 in the formula Unity, Criticism, Unity. To elaborate, that means starting from the desire for unity, resolving contradictions through criticism or struggle, and arriving at a new unity on a new basis. You may remember that when Biden took power in 2021, the first campaign they pushed was unity. You may remember that. But of course, it would be on their terms because we were going to have a long winter of disease and death if you were one of those nasty anti-vaxxers. In our experience, Mao said this is the correct method of resolving contradictions among the people. This new method, I'm summarizing a paragraph here, this new method, which is less brutal, is one of starting from the desire for unity, distinguishing between right and wrong through criticism or struggle, and arriving at a new unity on a new basis. Now, I told you guys earlier, Alice Bailey's program was called The Science of Right Human Relations, and so that's the theosophy, right? So you're going to determine between right and wrong, and what you're going to do is subject people to criticism until they start feeling guilty and confessing all the time. It's actually been described as a cult of confession. And there were huge pressure campaigns that I say, and we'll talk about this in the last lecture, that are a precursor to what I call opt-in tyranny. We're opting into our own tyranny just by making our lives miserable if we don't participate in what they say we have to do. What we call brainwashing, Mao called ideological remolding. Thought reform is how psychologist Robert J. Lifton translated it, and it was done mostly through struggle sessions. I won't read this whole paragraph, but it's actually really stunning. This is a little bit from Mao. Although large numbers of intellectuals have made progress, they should not be complacent. They must continue to remold themselves, gradually shed their bourgeois world outlook and acquire the proletarian communist world outlook so that they can fit fully in with the needs of the new society and unite with the workers and peasants. So this is way more hive-like than the USSR. They're not going to force you to go along. You have to fit in. You don't belong if you don't get along. Belonging is the program today. This change in world outlook is fundamental, and up to now, most of our intellectuals cannot be said to have accomplished it. So it's a rebirth, and it's a qualitative change in how you are. We hope that they will continue to make progress, and that in the course of work and study, they will gradually acquire the communist world outlook, grasp Marxism-Leninism, and become integrated with the workers and peasants. We hope that they will not stop halfway, or what is worse, slide back, for there will be no future for them in going backwards. Imagine if you didn't get your shot, you might lose your job. And he goes on and actually talks about how they won't have opportunities for work and all of these other things if they don't get along. So this is what I mean by totalism. It's pervading every aspect of society, but it's a pressure to join in the revolution. These are exercises of commitment. Mao put out a lot of exercises of commitment. I think my favorite are the anti-pest campaigns. He would give the entire society a stupid project that they had to go do. So there's too many pests. In the cities, let's say there's too many rats, right? The rats are infesting all of our grain. We have to get rid of the rats. So if you want to be able to get your food at the canteen, you have to present 10 rat tails once a week to get your ration coupons. So you have to get the rat tails, right? Well, people freaked out, and a lot of people didn't know how to get rat tails, so the entire black market in rat tails comes up, and what is going to happen? What's the easiest way to get a lot of rat tails, ladies and gentlemen? Breed rats. Guess what happened next? Not hard. He had another one where people were supposed to catch flies. Easiest way to get enough flies to meet your quota was breed flies. And they ended up with more and more and more the problems. Another pest was the swallows. So he made everybody go chase birds. I mean, literally chase birds with sticks until they dropped out of the air dead with exhaustion, or shoot them, or whatever else they had to do to kill the birds, because the birds were pilfering the grain. Turns out the birds were eating the bugs that were pilfering the grain, and they had a famine the next year because the swallows were all dead, and then they had a plague of insects. None of this worked, in other words, and it culminates in this huge disaster called the Great Leap Forward, where it's the greatest calamity in human history. And all of what's going on that I just talked about with Stalin and then with Mao forces the biggest change in communism probably since the Bolshevik Revolution in the decade from 1952 to 1962. And what happened? Well, first of all, Stalin died in 1953, created a vacuum of power in the Soviet Union. It eventually got filled by Khrushchev. Now, Nikita Khrushchev is not a particularly strong guy, not like Stalin at least, for sure. And so in 1956, in order to consolidate his power, he steps out and he reads the crimes of Stalin publicly. He airs how brutal and awful and, human rights abuses like nobody could believe that Stalin did, and completely tars and feathers his predecessor. This causes a shock throughout the entire communist world. The entire communist world has to liberalize, not be Stalin. They called it de-Stalinization. They had to de-Stalinize. All of Western Marxism, as we'll talk about tomorrow, lurches away from totalitarianism all of a sudden. The fascists are kind of like, whoa, that's bad. Everything changes of the crimes of Stalin. But then in 1962, the CCP kicked Mao out of power. Believe that if you can, that he's the sitting dictator of the CCP, and they kicked him out of power because the Great Leap Forward was so catastrophic. It's so unbelievably catastrophic. He resigned in shame under tremendous pressure, only to come back 4 years later and take it back. And like I said, they did a great leap forward that ruined everything. We're doing a great leap backwards. What do you think is going to happen? So, one of the more interesting things that Mao did with the de-Stalinization process was the 100 Flowers campaign. He said, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. Let's all have free speech in China. Tell us what's wrong with socialism. Tell us what's wrong with the government. This is in 1957. And he thought, it's documented that he thought that he had brainwashed the population so thoroughly, they were so transformed already to socialism, that he had done such a good job making the socialist man, that they would all defend socialism and say everything's great. Well, in 4 months, people complained so much that the government was overflowing with complaints, and everywhere throughout, I think they almost lost the party. I think communism almost collapsed in China in 4 or 5 months. A few more months of this, people were destroying the communes. They were chasing the communists down the street in humiliation, taking back their farms as private farms, like figuring out how to fix all the damage that had been done with just 4 months of free speech. That's how powerful free speech is against tyranny. 4 months of free speech. So Mao, of course, being a savvy snake operator, says, aha, it was a big trick. And he actually went back and rewrote the speech where he declared it. And he said that it was actually the first step of an anti-rightist campaign where he would lure the snakes out of their holes and then cut their heads off. And so then the anti-rightist campaign in 1957 followed. Everybody who dared disagree with Mao or the party got rounded up and killed in huge numbers or sent off to Gulag in huge numbers. And so the Great Leap Forward had literally no opposition, even though a lot of people are like, this is a really bad idea. And that's how you end up killing maybe 200 million, but at least 100 million people in 4 years in the Great Leap Forward. Maybe it's only 50 million, who knows? Turns out they didn't keep accurate records. They were lying about everything all the time. So that's basically the death of industrial communism, and Mao's comeback gives birth to kind of a new model of communism in Mao 2.0 with the Cultural Revolution. And so this is based on identity politics. It's based on agitating the youth to rebel for you, the idealistic youth. You're going to separate the population into 2 categories, red category and black, like I mentioned before. And you're going to tell the red category that they have basically access to society and the black that they don't, and that you get to attack the black category people, physical violence. The police will stand down and let you. It looks kind of like what's happening in reverse or whatever in Britain right now. And very, very scary views. But actually, it turns out that the identity politics didn't use these categories of people broken into 10 classes, which were on the black side. They were the bad guys were landlords, rich farmers, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements or bad influences, and right-wingers. And then on the good side were laborers and peasants, so your hammer and sickle are present. And then you had revolutionary soldiers, revolutionary leaders or cadres, and revolutionary martyrs. So you could either be a revolutionary or you could be a laborer or a peasant if you wanted to have something approximating a civic life in China during the Cultural Revolution. But it didn't really have red and black. There are really 4. Because peasants and workers, you can't become those. Those are tokens. Those are the things, the people that it's all being done in their name. The revolutionaries are really the red class. And then on the other side, you have landlords and rich farmers that are being scapegoated. They're the monsters of society. But then you have counter-revolutionaries, bad influences like Alex Jones, and I'm not joking, conspiracy theorists, and is our word for that same thing today, and right-wingers. Those are the demons. So Mao had an essay called Sweep Away the Monsters and Demons. And I think that the way that the dynamic of his identity politics actually worked is that you do everything in the names of the tokens. The revolutionaries actually drive the action, and you scapegoat the so-called monsters, and you demonize and punish the demons. And the goal is to try to get as many people in the black classes or as many people in the token classes to become revolutionaries as possible. The goal is to create a revolutionary army, and it was primarily built out of young people who were idealistic and huge Mao Zedong cult of personality fanatics who enjoyed a campaign called Smash the Four Olds, which is also called Unburdened by What Has Been. There's a poster I was sent the other day by Xi Van Fleet, my friend, that in Chinese says, "Smash the old world, build the new world." So if you want that to be, be unburdened by what has been so we can be able to see what can be, or if you want that to be build back better, I don't care which one it is. That's the ethos of this Smash the Four Olds, which were old values, old customs, old habits, and old ways of thinking and doing things. So the enemy in Mao 2.0, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, was anything old and anything that represented old ways of doing things. We're going to have a completely new blank slate. So it's got a very French Revolution vibe to it, and it's very cultural like the French Revolution, and it was very dangerous and bloody. So they would raid houses, they would steal pictures. If you had a letter your mother sent you that was old, that had to be all burned. Temples had to be desecrated, all the old things had to be destroyed, and people were hauled out in humiliation sessions called struggle sessions, including eventually Mao Zedong's replacement, Liu Shaoqi, who had been one of his right-hand men back in the earlier times of his reign. Liu Shaoqi is the new sitting president that replaced him, therefore Mao's new political rival. The Red Guard rounds him up in 1967. Liu Shaoqi says, am I not a person? Do I not have a voice? And they said, no, you are not. You're an enemy of the people. They sent him off to die in the countryside in hard labor. Mao took his power back, and then Mao turned around and within a year, by the middle of 68, deployed the People's Liberation Army on the Red Guard that had got him back into power because he said they were too radical. So all of these young people that they're breaking and turning woke are very likely not going to be kept around. They're destabilizers, and once the power grab is done, they don't need destabilizers. They need people for the phase of building socialism. And I think that that's all visible, first of all, in Mao, but second of all, in the fact that we're running the Maoist model here. By the 60s, every Marxist and the cultural Marxist or critical Marxist movement was claiming that they were a Maoist. The black liberationists or the Black Panthers openly said that they were operating under Mao Zedong's ideas and revolutionary tactics. Paulo Freire, whose critical pedagogy was imported to transform our education system, which is how it operates now, said he built his model off of Mao Zedong's method of education. So Mao's toolkit became the necessary piece to figure out how to actually start transforming the United States and the rest of the West after the attempted revolutions of 1968 failed. They went Maoist after that didn't work out. And so a big mutation, as we talk about the evolution of Marxism, occurred. So I summarized, I only went 10 minutes over, not too bad. In the industrial communism or state communism era, I did summarize kind of quickly on some of that stuff. We see communism evolve from this kind of Marxist, organic, evangelistic, go tell the workers, go among the workers, wake them up kind of religion, to a strictly enforced state religion that became increasingly inquisitorial and totalitarian in its nature. Communism became established as a state church that had to crush all other religious belief to get it out of the way and force conversion or transformation and belief in communism. In other words, they had to become the semi-demiurge so they could destroy the demiurge. Then at the end of this period of developing industrial communism, this new model of state-forced communist power, everything kind of fell apart, and there's this sort of charismatic rebirth, cultural Marxism that's being born in China, at least, not so much in the USSR, largely through changing the role from state-enforced punishment and discipline and totalitarianism to self-criticism and remolding of your own values, ideological remolding of the individual, switching from a forced upon you tyranny that you cannot opt out of to one that you want to opt into because your life sucks if you don't do what the tyrant wants you to do. And they can make your life suck more and more and more until you go along with it, which should sound an awful lot like vaccine passports, or raising your fist and putting the black square in your social media and saying Black Lives Matter on your social media. These are all Maoist tactics. We just went through a Maoist cultural revolution for the last 4 years in this country, and we're actually doing better than China did. So there's a lot of hope. That transformative theosophical religion never went away, though. It's always there underneath the surface. So industrial or state communism was an experiment in forcing communist transformation, which is the core of its religion, and it failed utterly at a tremendous cost of human life and poverty and misery and destruction, including the destruction of nature on scales that have never really been seen before. They talk about sustainability now. These people have the cheek to talk about sustainability after that. In parallel to these evolutionary developments, though, in totalizing communism in the East, where they had the power over the feudal system that they conquered to do whatever they wanted, we had a subversive, powerless, conniving communism developing in the West. And that's what we're going to start with tomorrow morning. Thank you.